Welcome. My name is Stephanie Guyette. I'm the Associate Director of the UMass Lowell Innovation Hub, and I'm with my colleague Lisa Armstrong. The UMass Lowell Innovation Hub is a business incubator and co-working space. We have locations in Haverhill, Mass. And Lowell, Mass. And we serve early stage technology companies, entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses with office space, co-working space, programming, events, all kinds of resources to support entrepreneurs and startups and new businesses. We, like everything else, have taken our programming virtual during this time. While our spaces are open, we do have members coming in, and members are able to continue to work from our space, utilize our facility, our resources such as our prototyping lab, and we've made all sorts of appropriate accommodations and cleaning and mask wearing and things for COVID protocols. So we're glad that we're able to continue to operate and support members during this time. We've done virtual programming. So we do a webinar series, which is what you're here for today, where we invite distinguished speakers. And we were fortunate enough that we didn't have to look very far for today's speaker because she's one of our faculty members here at UMass Lowell. And we're just really excited to have her here today. We are recording this session, and we will share the recording link with you as well. So if you can't stay the whole time or anything, you will have that. We have a poll live right now. So as you're coming in, please fill out the poll and just let us know what you're thinking about on this topic. And we are encouraging you to use the chat feature during the program. Any comments, questions, we will be kind of monitoring that and save questions till the end. And Beth has left time for that. So don't worry about it. We'll have a hopefully good discussion toward the end of the program. But if you want to make any comments, tell us why you're here, let us know where you're coming from. I always love to see that the benefit of these virtual programs is we've had people join us from all over the world. So that's been really exciting to meet new people because we're virtual now. I would also just like to thank my colleague Lisa, who's going to help me today, and she'll be kind of monitoring some of our Q&A later in the program. Our topic today is She-Cession and the challenges and opportunities for working women during and after the pandemic. Since we came up with this and we've been working with Beth on this topic, I don't know about you, but I've seen that word everywhere now. And even in just the last 2 weeks, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and others have been writing about this exact topic, right? And what's happening to women, working mothers during the pandemic, and how far back it could set us professionally. It's something that, women issues in the workplace is something that Dr. Humbert has been working on and researching for a long time. So she's the perfect expert to help us with this topic. I know I'm personally very excited to hear from her and kind of learn more. And I think what we're trying to do today is talk about where we are and what's going on, but also offer some strategies, some opportunities, some hope, some, good, ideas of how we're going to get through this together and ways that we can all work together and help each other through a challenging time. So I know that it's not going to be doom and gloom. It's going to be positive, and we have a lot that we can learn. I do want to introduce our speaker for everybody before I turn it over to her. Dr. Humbert is a UMass Lowell Associate Professor of Management in the Manning School of Business. She's an expert on issues of worker identity, gender and diversity, regional dynamics in organizations, and the changing nature of work. Her work has been published in the top academic journals, such as the Academy of Management Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, and the Harvard Business Review, and has been featured in many popular press outlets. Since the pandemic, she's been a leading voice on the impact of the crisis on women and their careers, and has been featured in several media articles, including NPR, New Hampshire Business Review, Boston Herald, and the Lowell Sun. And thank you all so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
All right, awesome. I assume you can hear me, Stephanie and Lisa, yeah? All right, great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction, Stephanie. I feel like having done this for about a decade now, you still never totally get used to being introduced, especially when you're just staring at a screen on Zoom. But thank you for that. I'm happy to be here today and was pleased that Stephanie and Lisa reached out to have this topic run through the iHub webinar series. And I'm pleased to see how many people have joined. This is bursting at the seams compared to attendance in some of our Zoom classes that we're running. So thank you all for taking time. I hope this will be time well spent, maybe your lunch hour, sit back, relax, listen. And I am, as Stephanie said, going to try to strike a balance between being real and honest about the situation that we're facing right now, but also share what myself and others are seeing as some hopeful silver linings for more the longer term around women's careers. In a minute, I'll get started and tell you a little bit more about the topic and what we're going to do today, but I wanted to take a minute just to reflect on the fact that, so I've been studying, as Stephanie said, issues around women and work and gender and professional advancement and work family for a while now. I'm a full-time faculty member at the business school. And one of the greatest joys, I think many of us faculty and researchers would tell you, is when areas of our expertise are part of public conversation. So I've always been really motivated, in addition to publishing, academic articles, to speaking to media and companies and real people about what my research is about. But I would say it's kind of been a catch-22 right now. I'm happy that I'm able to provide some insight. A number of people in my area of work are doing so around the issues we're facing. But it's tough. I don't necessarily want to be sharing my expertise for such a, troubling set of trends that we're starting to see. And so in creating this presentation, it was helpful for me as well to really start to think through how we're going to kind of chart our way through what, it has been progress for a while. We're seeing some setbacks and how we're going to maybe course correct. And the other point I wanted to just quickly touch upon, because this will get, this is sort of the intersection of research and what's going on out there, but for many of us, a very personal topic and journey and experience. In my doctoral training, they often told us that when you do research, it becomes me search, because the things that we are motivated to study and understand and the problems that we want to provide insight into are often things that we've struggled with or experienced ourselves. And that is no more true than it is now with this topic. I'm a full-time faculty member teaching, doing research. I have 2 young children, ages 6 and 9, and a spouse that works full-time. So we are okay. I keep saying we are okay. We're not great. We're not horrible. We're okay. And so I will be working through my own struggles around these issues, as I'm sure many of you are today. And so with that, I wanted to start recognizing that this is a personal topic with a couple just quick snippets of stories. These are, what is it that we usually say? The names and faces and events have been changed to protect the innocent, but these are all stories of people that I know or have met in the past couple months around this. And as I just quickly share these, reflect on your own experience. I'm sure some of this may describe you, some may describe people you know, some may describe people that you work with or work for. And I will just begin with that. Let's see where my cursor. She left her 20-year career in order to manage her children's remote learning. She pared back to part-time so she could provide more help to her aging parents. She turned down the extra hours at her retail job because she couldn't find anyone to watch her child. She said yes to the promotion that she'd previously turned down because now it didn't involve as much travel. She made it to that late afternoon meeting that she used to have to miss because now her work from home partner could pick up the kids off the bus. She finally pursued her passion of opening a clothing boutique because of the flexibility and freedom that her day job now offered. So I could come up with dozens more stories on both sides of the coin. The point here is to really stress what Stephanie opened with, that we're going to try to look at this situation of women in work during the pandemic and beyond by recognizing there's certainly a host of challenges facing us individually, organizationally, societally, but there's also some reason to be looking to these silver linings. And so with that, I wanted to welcome you all. I'm going to use that as my cue to end this poll. I find that these webinars, the difference from being, among many differences of being in real life, is that I can't kind of look out and see who's in the audience and maybe let people introduce one another at their tables. So a poll has been sort of the best way to get a sense of who's in the audience and what you're sort of bringing to this session. So you can just take a look here. It looks like about half of us feel our careers, at least right now, are relatively the same. That's promising news in and of itself. We've got some people whose careers seem to be in better shape today as compared to prior to the pandemic, some equally that feel like their careers in worse shape, and a number of us that just aren't sure yet. We have a decent amount of us that are somewhat concerned about the context facing women's careers, some that are very concerned, and also some reasons to be hopeful and optimistic. And it looks like the vast majority of us are attending today to help ourselves, maybe our employees that we manage or our colleagues, and also to help our organizations. So thank you for participating in that. And I will stop sharing. I think that those will save those, Stephanie, if we want to use those for anything else. And just set for today, what are kind of the goals for this session? We have an hour together, recognizing there's a very diverse array of folks attending, all the way from students to executives. This is also a complex topic even before the pandemic. We could spend an entire semester talking about the complex dynamics that go into issues of gender and work. And so I want to try to do justice, but without getting into the nitty gritty, and have something for everybody. So I've set our goals for this session. I hope that we will leave here understanding a bit more about the complex context facing women's careers, both prior, during, and hopefully after the pandemic. Recognize those potential silver linings and opportunities, partially to be hopeful, but also because we've got 100 people on this call that can maybe help shepherd us towards some of those opportunities that are out there. And then I do hope that we will each leave with one or more takeaways to better support yourself or your organization or people you're managing or colleagues. A couple quick caveats. Anytime that we are, talking about a demographic category, we recognize that I'm going to talk in aggregate about women, but we know that everybody's feeling the impacts, right? This is a lot of what I'm going to speak to today are impacts that men are feeling just as much as women. And some might argue that it's allowing men to feel some impacts that women have felt for a long time. So the topic I was asked to speak about are women's careers, but that doesn't mean that these dynamics are only impacting women. Secondly, this is, of course, not a single story. That's sometimes a phrase we'll use when we're talking about diversity, and recognize that, yes, we're talking about women, but there's a lot of variance within women in terms of their experiences based on their career stage, their industry, their geographic location, their familial situation, socioeconomic differences, racial differences. So I'm going to bring out some of those where I can with the statistics, but again, we're talking kind of aggregated patterns facing women in general right now, recognizing there's a lot of variance within. And then last but not least, you'll hear me talk about things like gender roles and what we expect for women and men in the workplace and at home. And that's really sort of a sociologist's way of talking about patterns that we see. This doesn't mean that this characterizes every individual woman or every couple who may exist in a family that doesn't operate under those sort of entrenched norms of gender. But when we're kind of trying to understand the trends and the patterns, and we talk about roles and expectations, we're talking about sort of a higher level on average. And so with that, I wanted to start, some of you may know these statistics, some of you may not, but just to recognize, where were women's careers standing pre-pandemic? What was this looking like? And for a good reason, there was some reason to be hopeful for progress at large. If you look at this graph here, and maybe you know this, but over the past 6 to 7 decades, we've largely seen steady increases in terms of women's participation in the labor force. So from 1950 to, this is projected out to 2024, I believe, steady increases in the number of women working, and even during a number of economic downturns. So the beauty in looking sort of at this vantage point over time at this graph is that, yeah, there's some dips, at times when you were living through them, but by and large, we've seen some decent progress. Similarly, we haven't just seen increases in women's participation in the labor force, but actually women's participation increasing at an increasing rate relative to men. So another way to think of that is the percentage of women in the overall labor force was starting to get much closer to the percentage of men. And as this graph shows, was projected to sort of continue being a little bit more equal toward, projecting out to 2024. Now that of course doesn't account for, we know that If we looked at levels in the organization or leadership attainment, it's not as close. This is mere participation in the workforce, but again, some relatively positive trends. And then last but not least, we were seeing some positive trend in terms of income and earnings. This graph looks at within heterosexual couples and talks about the proportion of female breadwinners. So when a woman earns more than the man in that dual career couple. And by and large, we've seen improvement. Of course, still men primarily earn more, but from 1980 to 2017, we see those. So this is all good news for women's progress, right? We see increase in women's labor force participation, increase in the share of the labor force held by women, and increases in the earnings that women are making relative to men. And so what I'll often say to my students at this point is like, great, we've solved all the world's problems and we can just walk away, right? This is all good news, or is it? Actually, my son was watching me make these slides yesterday and he loved that I put that emoji in there. So we're learning ways to appeal to all different generations via technology. So all good news, right? Sort of. So this is the important part to recognize what the context truly was before this pandemic period. Certainly progress had been made, potentially not as quick as some people would have liked, but you can't deny that looking at those graphs, there was some good signs of improvement. However, there still were challenges that remained even prior to the pandemic. And one has to do with what I just mentioned briefly in those caveats, is that these gendered expectations we have, our sort of societal view of who belongs at work and who belongs doing caregiving and household labor, are sticky. And that means they're hard to change. So even as women have entered the workforce in greater numbers, you do surveys of sort of values and views among the general population. Women and men alike still generally tend to associate women more with caregiving and household work and men more with professional external work. And so what that has meant, because those are sort of just norms and expectations out in the world, is that what some people have called is that women started to take on what was known as the second shift. They were now working outside of the home, as we saw in those graphs, but somebody still needed to take care of the children in the house. And by and large, that was falling to women. Now, we've seen improvements in men's involvement in caregiving and household work. I've done some work myself on what people are calling involved fatherhood. We've seen some great improvements in terms of men's ability to help in those domains. But again, on the aggregated patterns, the expectations were still such that women were taking on more of that unpaid care. The other piece to that is that our organizations and our sort of work life expectations still largely operated based on the assumption of the traditional family, which was one person worked outside of the home, one person stayed home. Largely, it was the man outside, the woman inside. And even though we've come a long way from that traditional structure, the latest statistics say only about a quarter of families in this country still fit that model. 3/4 of families are either dual earning couples or single parent families or blended families. But our norms for what we expect of our workers are still that they come to work, they're fully committed to work, they don't have any other cares to worry about, and that they're fully devoted to us when they're here. Okay, and so again, these are sort of aggregated patterns. It doesn't mean that you may work in an organization that doesn't operate that way, but by and large, there was still challenges around disrupting those norms of what it means to be a good worker. And then lastly, when families came to a decision around, okay, how are we going to make this work? If someone's career needs to take priority and somebody's career needs to kind of take the back road, it still largely becomes an economic decision within families. And typically, because we know that on the whole, men still tend to make more money, often if that decision was needed to be made within a family, more likely that the woman was going to be the one that would leave or scale back. Okay, so long way of saying, yes, there's progress in all of those graphs, but some challenges still remain, some inequities still remain, because our norms and expectations around gender are very sticky and hard to disrupt. And so what has been crucial to making this work, if any of you feel like this woman in the photo trying to remain zen amidst all of the competing demands, one of the things that allowed so many dual career couples and women in the workforce to sustain was the level of support systems that we could draw on, whether that be childcare or aftercare or day camp or family members. And that's really how we were holding this all together. So enter She-Cession 2020. We'll talk a minute about what that term actually means, but as Stephanie alluded to at the beginning, there is no shortage of headlines that largely make you feel like you want to puke, right? I mean, I could have filled up 4 slides worth of these headlines. The ones here have all come out in the last month. There were headlines prior to this. There will be more to come that really paint a relatively dire picture of what we have done to the progress that all of those graphs just showed. Stick with me. I promise I'll give us some hopeful feelings after we set the stage. So She-Cession, if you haven't heard the term, is really what's being used to sort of popularize this notion that the current recession is having a disproportionate impact on women's employment. Prior recessions, particularly our most recent one, the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, sometimes was dubbed a man-cession because it hit sectors like manufacturing and construction really hard, which tended to be predominantly occupied by men. This one is different. They are saying it is the first recession that has had such a disproportionate impact on women, largely because it's the first time that we've had so many women in the workforce, and also because of a number of other factors that I'll explain right now. The first is that the sectors that were initially hit hardest by unemployment in the pandemic were sectors that were overwhelmingly employing women. So things like leisure, hospitality, retail, restaurants, some parts of healthcare, some parts of education. And so there are many industries that are still very sort of segregated occupationally, such that they have more women in them than men, or that women are overrepresented in the lower level clerical or administrative positions. And so what we saw that was unique here is that the industries that were hit hardest when we had to initially contain this pandemic were industries that were overwhelmingly had more women working in them than men. Add to that what I just alluded to, all of those systems that were there to kind of help sustain women in the workforce or working families, a lot of them became very unreliable or unavailable. Childcare closed, schools closed. We weren't sure if summer camps were going to be open. Family members that maybe helped to bear the load, we were told not to go near. And so we had a situation where women's unemployment was higher. And then for those women that still were able to work, a lot of those support systems that allowed them to hold it all together were kind of pulled away. And so one thing that we know to be true is that in times of crisis, existing inequalities exacerbate. And so I just showed you in the prior section that even though we'd made progress, there still was some inequitable division of labor in terms of work and non-work and expectations for men versus women. And so in this time of crisis, those inequities are exacerbated, and sadly, we're seeing some very concerning declines in all of that progress that I just painted for you. Let me show you what women's careers are looking like right now, the pandemic edition. If you've done any reading on this, this won't be surprising to you, but I will say, as much as I talk to reporters and people about this often, it's still shocking every time I have to say the share of women in the workforce right now is down to levels we have not seen since 1988. In September alone, maybe you read that over 850,000 women left the workforce. And as these graphs show, we still have a number of women that are considering that they may need to leave the workforce or reduce their hours. And that is particularly acute for women with children and then women with young children. And that goes along with what we were just saying about the collapse of some of those support systems. An interesting thing is if you know anything about the labor reports that come out, typically there's something that they report on called voluntary quits rate. And these would be people that choose to leave a job. So they're not laid off or they're not fired or they're not let go or severed. They actually choose to leave their career. And in normal times, that quits rate is usually actually an indicator of confidence in the economy. So if we have a high voluntary quits rate, it means people feel confident in employment and in the economy because they're choosing to leave a job because they think that they will be able to find something else. That's another economic indicator that's really flipped on its head in this context. The voluntary quits rate in the last jobs report was really high, but it's driven by exactly this, the number of women that have had to voluntarily leave the workforce in order to manage what's happened with the collapse of all of these support systems. Part of that is also people who maybe have left their jobs because of health concerns. And then on top of that, as I alluded to initially, existing inequalities are exacerbated in times of crisis. And so unfortunately, these declining trends that we've seen, the demographics that they're hitting the hardest are mothers without a college education that have young children. And then our non-white, Hispanic and Black unemployment rates are higher than white counterparts, even for women. And so we've got some big, messy challenges here. In addition to just looking at sort of the declines in these rates and the reasons that these systems, that people are choosing to leave the workforce, a lot of us that are doing work in this area, and even people not doing work in this area, frankly, are trying to figure out, how did we get here? And so one of the things is really a recognition that all of our systems are very interdependent. And these are things that economists and those of us that study organizations and sociologists have known for a long time. But in our way that we sort of operate in our day-to-day life, we tend to treat all of these systems as disconnected. And I'm talking about, public health, employment, economic systems, families, childcare, the economy at large. And I've been talking about it as sort of the game of Jenga, right? It's like everything was kind of neatly held together, and maybe we took for granted how interdependent all of those systems were. And if you pull out one Jenga block, one of those systems isn't held together anymore. So for the context of what we're talking about, call it childcare, the whole system is feeling strains. The economy, the employment, healthcare. The recent thing I was just looking at was talking about how actually hospitals are having trouble with having employees right now, because a lot of them are parents that are having the same struggles us professional parents are having with needing places for our kids to go. And so we have a big problem here, right? And we all know that there's some sort of essential lagging things in this country that could potentially help by way of better paid leave, better affordable childcare. And even a recent Harvard Business Review article I looked at said, yes, those things are essential, but they're lagging so much that they can't even solve our problem right now. So the ideal is that we're going to use this to figure a lot of that out. But one of the slogans I've been using as I talk about this is we also have to meet the context where it's at. And right now, what we largely have to kind of help individual women and men and families navigate through this is support from organizations. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Unfortunately, fortunately, for better or worse, organizations and managers are having to pick up the slack in terms of how to support families in this mess that we're in. And then the last point is that this recession is different. Typically, recessions are usually sparked by some sort of underlying structural issue with the economy that then causes behaviors to change. This is flipped, right? The underlying issue here was behavioral change driven by the pandemic. And therefore, we don't really have a blueprint for how employment or job rates are going to bounce back. We hope that as soon as the threat of the virus is no longer here, that those things will kind of naturally bounce back. But we can't actually look at, what happened in the Great Recession because the dynamics here are so different. All right. So Rowdy, for those of you that aren't UMass Lowell associated, is our mascot. And he's thinking what a lot of you are thinking right now. I'm at the 12:30 mark, right about where I wanted to be. Didn't she say silver lining? So take a deep breath or have a sip of your daytime wine, because now we'll try to make things look a little better. I see Lisa and Stephanie laughing, so I haven't been kicked out yet from my jokes. All right, so what is some of the good that can come of this? So I should have said this at the beginning. Obviously, I have expertise in this area, but these are not all of my original ideas. If you've read any of these articles, a lot of us are talking about this. And I do think the timing of this webinar is good, because I think even 3 months ago, 2 months ago, it was a little bit hard to see what good could come. And I think there's starting to be some consensus around some positive trends that this mess could bring to us. And one is I've been talking about as we've really ripped off the Band-Aid with respect to flexible and remote work. For folks like myself that for a while have been trying to study and figure out how can organizations better support working men and women, we've talked a lot about the ability to work flexibly, to not tie employees to their cubicles, for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And it wasn't that people didn't want to figure that out, but we suffer in organizations a lot from the "this is how we've always done it" bias. And so it was really hard for managers and leaders and organizations and even workers themselves to even imagine how we could do things differently. And what this sort of great natural experiment caused is it ripped off the Band-Aid and everybody had to figure out how to work flexibly and remotely. A number of managers that I've spoken to have made the comment that we just never thought we could, care for our clients in this fashion. We just never thought we could manage a group of 15 employees in a remote, dispersed environment. And here we are, we've figured it out. Now, I'm not to say that everything's going smoothly. There's been some concerns around productivity and overwork and isolation. I'm not a believer that we should be 24/7, 365 remote forever now. I think there's a balance to be found, and we need to have some physical presence to innovate and collaborate. But I think that we now have the building blocks to figure out how to be more flexible in the way that we expect people to work, to relax some of those ideal worker norms and trust that we can do our work a lot of different ways and maybe even better. That this isn't just about helping women to stay in the workforce, but actually we can probably be more effective as a workforce and as an organization if we find that balance with remote work. So that's really promising. The second is one of the things we talk about often pre-pandemic around women and that need to kind of scale back and scale into a career. Often you'll see women take 2 to 5 years off for child rearing, or maybe somebody needs to take a leave to help for care for an aging family member. And one of the struggles has always been, how do I get back in? So there's a lot of work on sort of off-roads and on-ramps in women's careers. And a lot of time was spent coaching women on, and even organizations, and understanding how people explain these breaks in their careers, right? You need to tell a good story to show, even though you were out of the workforce for 5 years, that you can still be up and hit the ground running from where you were. And I think that's no longer going to be this odd duck story, right? Right now, at least for this break, if we have 865,000 women that had to leave the workforce just in September, that's a cohort of people that are going to have a break in their resume. I've heard people joke of it as like the COVID clause. Nobody's going to ask or need you to explain in depth why you had a break in your resume during this period. My larger hope, though, than just this is that we will have a greater appreciation for that's what careers look like today. We've known this, that we no longer have like our parents or grandparents that entered a job at, 22 at one company, worked their way up for 30 to 40 years, had a pension, stayed in that same company and left. That's been gone for a while. The latest statistics suggest that over the course of a career, people will have on average 10 transitions. And so can this at least help us recognize it's not just women having to kind of off-road and on-ramp for child rearing, that a lot of us are going to have highs and lows and peaks and valleys in our career. And so maybe that'll no longer be such a unique story to tell. The next one is, this has happened for everyone, right? It's misery loves company. We're not glad that people are struggling, but the boundaries have collapsed for everyone, men, women, old, young, hourly workers, salaried workers. We are all experiencing this. And this quote was from a recent article I read that said, even if it was somewhat forced, we all have a greater openness now about what combining career and caregiving, or insert anything, career and household work, what that actually looks like. And once you've experienced this, it's going to be really hard to act like we've never seen this before. So what often was left up to either companies to have a really good sort of flex policy for people that had to kind of dial up or dial back, or even more common was individual women having to negotiate with their managers for some flexibility in more of an informal fashion, I hope now will be less of an anomaly and more of sort of a proactive approach on behalf of the organization and managers, that we now know what this looks like to try to manage all of this together. And really what that says is the curtain's been peeled back, right? We're having these conversations. It may have been something in some organizations that was talked about, some organizations that were really ahead of the game and helping to manage this dance. Now this is just common conversation, right? How are you doing it? How are you making it work? yes, those headlines are depressing to read, but those headlines are everywhere. And so it's my hope this is one of these areas that we all kind of have a role to play. We're creatures of habit. It would be really easy that once we make it through this to just snap back to how we used to work and not talk about these things and not act like people had lives to manage outside of work. And so it's on all of us to kind of use this as a springboard, I hope, leaders and organizations especially, to try to figure out a way through this that, again, isn't just about, oh, let's make it easier for women, but actually can be a better way, a more effective way to structure work and expectations at large. And that can lead to more effectiveness for organizations and for the workforce. So there are signs of hope, but we're still somewhat in the mess. And so what I wanted to sort of end this last section with is, as Lisa and Stephanie had asked, is, what can we do in the meantime? What can we do as organizations and managers to support employees, to navigate through this, to build on some of these silver linings? And then what can we do as individuals as well? So the first, probably an easiest thing we can do as leaders and managers is model visibility. And that's different than transparency. It's truly being visible, of showing the struggle that we're all in. I don't know if folks remember, but this picture here is from, I think it was 2017 at this point. A professor was on the BBC News and his child came in the background, and it went viral, and there's been, spoofs on it, and there's been things describing what it's like. But at the time, this was unique, right? And now this is the norm. I mean, I'm sure every single one of us could talk of give an example of a child walking in, or a spouse walking in, or a neighbor ringing the doorbell, the dog barking, because we're all working, in this dispersed environment. And early on, I remember even doing it myself, right? Saying to my husband, don't let the kids in, I'm on an important meeting. Or my husband actually manages a number of people, leave the kids out. And then you slowly realize that if we can model this and show that we're all going through it, it gives people permission to not be so stressed about that. So modeling the visibility, not just with, children entering the Zoom screen, but just sharing that we're all sort of having concerns and trying to work through this and having productive days and unproductive days. So that's one of the best and easiest things that organizations and leaders can do. The second is provide some certainty where possible. We're living in very uncertain times. It might be hard to tell your employees exactly when and how we're coming back to the office, but a lot of these organizations have been giving windows, right? We're going to push it out and say, okay, all remote at least until January, at least until June. And it gives people a segment of time to plan. But this doesn't just mean certainty in terms of where we're working. It's really also important right now to give certainty around expectations and performance. So often, those of us sort of working in traditional organizations, we know that we might have on the schedule to have the annual review or development discussion, but then we get really busy and we just end up saying, you know what, can you just sign off on your performance review? I have to send it into HR. Like, use this time to really have those conversations about how you're doing, what's going well, where can you improve? Because it removes some of that stress that people might have right now of, I need to overperform and better perform. I don't want to get laid off. Provide certainty around, are we considering layoffs, or we can provide job security at least through here, right? Like having those conversations that sometimes get glossed over in terms of performance and development, but also scheduling those one-on-one meetings that maybe in the hustle and bustle of everyday normal office life didn't happen enough. Recognizing that this is not business as usual. So some surveys are showing that people felt supported in an empathetic environment in March and April, and that over the summer that people were maybe forgetting that we're all working in this really unique scenario. So realizing that we're still in a unique situation, but also this is not business as usual, meaning let's not just take the way we did things in the office and in our sort of old world and reproduce them here in our virtual work world, right? Can we do things differently? Even when we bring people back into the office, or even if we're essential workers that haven't had a chance to leave, yes, we might be changing our processes because of health concerns, but how can we use this to really rethink the way we work and how we work to be more effective? One of the other areas that I've done work in is around the future of work and the way technology is disrupting the nature of work. use this time as an opportunity to try switching some of those, this is how we've always done it here processes. And then lastly, something I've been thinking and speaking a lot about is, we are still operating in an organizational culture right now, whether it be different than it was before, whether it's full remote or part remote or essential workers that are living with new constraints. And those norms are going to stick for better or worse. So let's realize right now that some of the good norms we're having, where we're asking people how they're doing, how are they feeling, how's their family. I mean, that's a management professor's dream, that we're actually going to have managers that care about their employees. Let's try to keep that up after the fact. But I also am getting concerned too that we're letting some dysfunctional norms come in the way, right? Maybe we don't really spend time bringing the whole team together as much as we used to, because it's a little harder in this environment. We don't want to lose that. Or maybe we work physically present because we've had to this whole time, and we've started having, a little bit of a culture of surveillance because we're asking people to follow the rules and we're reporting on people that aren't following the rules. And maybe we need to be doing that for health concerns, but we want to make sure we don't create this cultural norm after the fact that everybody feels like somebody's watching them and are going to tattle on them, right? So just recognizing, even though this isn't business as usual, we're still creating kind of norms for our organizations, for our teams. And we have to think about which of those we want to still be here when we hopefully ease out of this period. And then this is my last slide, and we'll open it for questions. What can you do to advocate for yourself and others? I have this picture here because I know that characterizes how a lot of us feel some of these days. And we maybe felt like that in our former work life as well, but maybe we had somebody walk by our office and said, oh God, you look like you're working hard. You want to take a break? Is everything okay? For a lot of us, we're looking like this in our homes and nobody can see us. And so one of the easiest things we can do is ask, right? That means ask for help. That means ask for clarity. When I'm teaching power and influence to our undergraduates, and we talk about the first step to having influence or having your voice heard or winning a negotiation is actually to ask. We can't get anywhere if we don't first ask. And now is probably a more important time than ever to just be clear about your needs. Request clarity on what your manager is looking for. Your manager or an organization may not be able to fix everything for you, but small adjustments right now can go a long way. And this also means if you have been laid off and you're looking for new work right now, I know we don't all have the luxury in this environment to wait for the perfect job, but you can ask, what is the remote work like here? Is it sustainable? How are the managers treating employees that have children? Because if you find yourself in a new job situation that isn't amenable to what you're going through, it's going to be worse in the long run. So ask again. Be grateful, but struggle. This is something that's somewhat personal to me. I know that we've all had this experience where we're struggling, but we think, well, at least I have a job, or at least my children are older, or at least my spouse is working. There's somebody worse, right? I stay awake at night thinking about the children that are in a worse scenario than my children. But that doesn't negate the fact that in our own situations, we're still struggling. This was a quote in a recent article, Wall Street Journal article on this very issue around women's careers. And she said, I really struggle with the gratefulness of being in a better position than a lot of people, but acknowledging that it's still very difficult. And think about how long way that can go with colleagues as well, right? They see you, they know you've got it put together. You're the manager, or you're their mentor. We're all struggling, and so it's okay to acknowledge that, even if we're in a better position than some others. Say no, but also say yes. So one of the sort of age-old wisdom over the past couple of decades for women in work is don't say yes to everything, right? Say no. People are going to always ask women to be the person who does extra, to take on extra administrative tasks, to do the friendly, help for a colleague. Now more than ever, we need to be comfortable saying no. It's okay right now to not take on extra things because we know we won't be effective at them. And in some ways, we have a really easy excuse right now. However, also say yes. Think back to some of those stories that I shared at the beginning. I do have a really close friend that had turned down a promotion in the past, and finally, with 3 young children in this context, was able to say yes because it didn't involve as much travel. I have a personal thing that I just took on in terms of our faculty senate that I almost didn't say yes to because I feel like things are really hard right now. And I'm glad I did. It's helping me to kind of reconnect to the organization, even in this dispersed environment. So don't be afraid also to say yes, even though we're in this sort of difficult, unique situation. And then this one is kind of the throwaway one because it feels like, oh, of course, have open, frequent, honest conversations, but actually really have those conversations. One of the recent article, Harvard Business Review just did a special kind of big idea issue on the pandemic, work, and parenting. And one of the people centered in one of the articles gave this example that she really was putting up this out of office message at the beginning saying, life is weird right now, please bear with me. And it opened her up to have a lot of support from people and people sharing what they were going through. We don't all have the luxury of putting up that out of office message. We may not be in a status position in an organization where we can do that. We may be an essential worker that can't take a time out of the office. But this is just a reminder that if we're telling organizations to model visibility, that, you know, the best we can all do right now is be open, be honest, have those conversations frequently. And you never know how much it's actually going to help you or the other person. I have a student right now that was struggling to keep up with things. I'm doing a weekly meeting with her, and it's actually really helping me because we're kind of connecting on our common experience right now, even though our objective situation in life is very different. And then my last piece of advice for all of us is hang in there, but not necessarily in that cheesy, like hang in there way. Actually really hang in there because those silver linings are coming. And I want to be here still working and having a, you know, good professional trajectory in front of me when some of those good changes in the nature and structure of work actually come to fruition, because I think that they will. And so I should have given this warning at the beginning that I often give to my students. I know I sometimes talk fast, but that means we have a good amount of time for questions. I see that the chat's been blowing up, but I'm gonna have left Stephanie and Lisa to handle that. And so I will pause now and welcome any questions that people have.
Thank you, Beth. That was great. You got me thinking of a lot of things and writing some notes down to myself. I think that stuff on the end that you just hit on the, you know, asking questions, ask for what you need, keep asking, and saying no. I feel like you really hit it on the head when you said that women are always asked to do extra, do the administrative tasks way more than, you know, even pre-COVID, you know, professional women, we're always seems that we do the administrative stuff no matter what our level is, and way more than men. I think that's just a true fact. One thing you touched on, which came in as a question to me a little while ago, but I did want to bring it back up, was the idea of feeling lucky that we still have a job, even though we're overwhelmed, we're stressed, we're dealing with aging parents and young children and all of these things. But yeah, we have a good job and financially, like, we're okay. What are some ways that we can kind of deal with that piece of this as, you know, professional women?
Yeah, I mean, so I will borrow again from something I just read in that special series in Harvard Business Review. And it said, if there's ever a time to let that mom guilt or, you know, women guilt or person guilt, human guilt go, now's the time. I don't think, you know, I think this is sort of something we struggle with in the human condition at large. Just because there's always someone in a worse situation than you, it doesn't mean that you should be okay. And I think perhaps maybe we don't teach that enough even to our children. We've kind of come to this value in society of being thankful and grateful for what we have, which is wonderful and we should. But I think right now, one of the unique things is that this has impacted everybody in some way. Sure, some more than others. But I think in some ways it gives us all the permission to recognize that, yeah, this is hard. I'll even use example again on my classes. I'll use the beginning to just chit chat with students and see how they're doing. And they're great professional kids. And inevitably someone will say, Professor Humbert, how are you doing? And I don't lie. I say, I'm okay. Like, we're okay. My kids are okay, but it's hard some days. So the best advice I can give is that. I mean, I'm trying to figure this out myself, right? But let go of the guilt, talk about it, be grateful, but struggle.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question that came to me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Are there some examples of specific policy improvements that can build off of the empathy we're experiencing now so that we can keep the momentum?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'll give two answers to that. So one is what I alluded to briefly, that a lot of organizations didn't necessarily have formal policies on the books for flexible work or for job sharing, for example, or for paring back to part-time. And in some ways that was useful to some people because they could negotiate with their manager something that worked. The problem was that always was left to the individual woman to work that out. And so one thing that I was speaking about on a podcast the other day with somebody who actually works for Gap headquarters is using this for organizations to be the proactive ones, right? To actually offer these, you know, not just flexible work arrangements in a traditional fashion, but allowing for job sharing. We have 2 parents that want to go part-time. Can we combine their job? But what I'm more so hopeful for, and what I think organizations need to do, is we've made a lot of progress in the past couple decades of having flexible work offerings and policies and benefits on the books. That doesn't always mean that they were used or encouraged to be used. And so we talk about what's the difference between what's espoused in our formal policies and what's enacted in the informal work of the culture every day. So things like paternity leave, for example. I know a lot of men that say, well, my company offers 6 weeks, but nobody takes more than 2, right? So really making sure if we're going to have these offerings on the book, that we have the informal culture within the different parts of our organization that not only encourages people to use it, but actually makes it part and parcel of the work process. So I hope that gives at least some sense. I don't know, you know, innovative ideas. There's a lot of innovative ideas out there. There's companies that offer sabbaticals. There's companies that offer job sharing. It's this gap between offering them and getting yourself on the, you know, your organization on the best place to work for working parents list. But then when you talk to actual employees there, it's like, yeah, that's on the books, but we're really encouraged not to use that, or we're really encouraged not to do that during busy season. So trying to reconnect that informal cultural norms around what of these formal offerings we can use.
Great, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Steph, too. One other question here, if you have time. I am curious how this will impact the current and potential future in the birth decline for those women who choose to have children. The decline will have a direct impact on the future workforce, Social Security, and discussion around immigration to complement the birth decline. Your thoughts on that?
So yeah, so these are big, messier, hairier problems than even some of what I wrote in there. And I'm certainly not by any means an immigration or you know, birth rate expert, but absolutely. I mean, these are we already were seeing that, right? If you put on that graph, probably a sociologist could do this better than me, but on some of the increase in women's labor force participation, and you put that with the birth rate or number of children per family, we already have seen over the past couple of decades a little bit of sort of a K curve happening with that. You know, I don't have eye to the future perfectly, but we already knew that in order to manage careers, women were waiting later to try to have children and running into more fertility issues, and the mismatch between women's biological clock and professional clock. And so, will it exacerbate that? Probably. I guess it matters how long this goes on and how quickly we can realize some of those silver linings we're seeing. Could we came back and do this, 15, 20 years from now? Do we see maybe that this is the punctuation where people are able to start having children a little bit earlier because they're not having to put it off so much for their career because our general work world is more supportive of balancing these things? So great question. I don't have, the exact answer, but something, of course, also to ensure that we're paying attention to.
Great. Another question. I am currently self-employed, but in my ideal world, I will see more corporate part-time positions. I would love to be back in the corporate world, but I would want a part-time role. Those don't often exist in the corporate world. And I know that's true. So do you see more of that maybe happening in the future?
So I hope so. I hope that would go back to 2 questions ago of what, this isn't necessarily innovative, but it could be innovative for companies to consider offering it. Again, there's some, in the last probably 5 years, there's been quite a few consultancies popping up that are really focused on helping women that had to take time out for child rearing and pairing them with companies that get it and are willing to take them back. There's one based out of Waltham, I'm forgetting the name right now, but it showed that there was an appetite for this even before this period. So the optimistic part of me says, yes, of course, companies will figure out that they can actually be more effective if they took that, one line and split it up into 2 part-time positions and be able to get, you know, two great workers with different complementary strengths and fill that up. I think there was already an appetite moving there in some forward-looking companies, and maybe, just maybe, this will be the, you know, the course correction that we needed. The pessimistic side of me has this kind of nagging concern that the longer this goes on, the more, once we are able to get our organizations at least back to maybe an equilibrium of where they were before, that some managers and leaders and organizations are going to overcompensate, right? And it's been so long that they haven't had direct sort of monitoring and surveillance of their teams together, that we're gonna overly increase our expectations for people to be present in there and full-time and overworked. And so I'm cautious around that, and I'm hoping that we can remember when we get there all that we've learned during this period.
Okay, I know we're getting close to ending time, but one question, and this is a good one too. One of the biggest questions I have is what work will look like when we're allowed more remote work during the week, but people will be going back into the office. Will those choosing to work remotely to manage work-life balance with families and children be left out of conversations and decisions by those going back into the office? It's okay for now because we're all remotely, but what's going to happen when we're all back?
Yeah, so great question. And again, this is where I really am hopeful and would like to see organizations coming out in front of this. So we've seen sort of, right now we're seeing three things happening. We've got companies, primarily tech companies, Twitter, Silicon Valley type companies that have said, we're remote forever for this foreseeable future. Then we had some other, primarily Wall Street, New York, JP Morgan, that were like, nope, let's get going here. We're going to start pulling people back in with safety protocols. There's been some issues with that. And then we've got this really big group in the middle that are kind of, for lack of a better term, continuing to kick the can down the road, right? Okay, we're going to be all remote till September. We're going to be all remote till December. We're going to be all remote till June. And on the one hand, I did mention earlier, I think that can be helpful in providing certainty to parents that are in this situation. But I am starting to feel like, and a colleague and I are writing about this, we're hitting a bit of a tipping point where it's okay if we're not bringing people back in yet, but we need to start kind of making a plan around that for exactly this reason. So are we going to say, the norm is going to be for everybody to come back, but because we know remote work works, you can all do that? Or are we going to have some sort of hybrid scenario where, you know, some people come in, you come in 2 days a week, you work from home 3 days a week. So I really think the key around that is going to be these informal norms again. The person asking the question, I can't see the names right now, is absolutely right that that's a concern. But I think it's one of these areas where let's not forget what we've learned during this period. How can we structure work in a way that we're not going to leave choices to employees that are going to allow for those differential outcomes? I don't know the exact answer yet, but a key is going to be those managers. Managers are always the sort of conduit between the company's decision and the individual's work experience. And so, you know, I hope I have a better answer on that, but I think you're right. That's a situation that we've ripped off the Band-Aid on this remote flexible work, but we haven't yet landed on what's the exact right kind of recipe for our next step. Really good question.
Great.
I wish I had more of a clear answer.
Well, that was great. And I guess maybe just one more.
Sure.
I'm curious to hear about any research on women taking the solopreneur route or starting a small business at this time.
Yeah, so there is some interesting work being done on this, at least in terms of there's a group, my brain's not functioning as well right now, but I just spoke with somebody from the New Hampshire, the Granite State Collaborative, and they were covering a group that's actually doing just that. They're trying to help women during this time to kind of kickstart a business. A couple things matter. One, we're actually seeing some concerns in terms of innovation around small businesses, and that this period may have, like, well, you guys know what I have, may have left a little bit of a gap in terms of seeding some of those small businesses that then get funded, you know, and become companies. On the other hand, we actually haven't seen the decline in venture capital, which is a good sign right now. So I know this solopreneur doesn't necessarily mean they would hit the level of venture capital, but if that's a indicator of, you know, there's still an appetite right now. And what I've actually heard a lot of people saying is there may be a window for Main Street USA to really kick up after this, right? That big box stores right during this period are going much more online, curbside pickup, they're making their footprint smaller. But when this all ends, or even when people have a chance to safely, they're going to want to go into a store. They're going to want to talk to a business owner, have that relationship part. And so I do think there could be a nice balance to come where we might see a little bit of a contraction in terms of the physical footprint of some of the big box stores, allowing some of those small businesses and small business owners to have a real niche. And then the last piece, which maybe is more what this person was talking about, is there are just some people that have a little bit more bandwidth right now to explore. So I have a really good friend that, because her job has gone remote and she can kind of manage it in different time pockets, was able to get a business idea off the ground that she had before. I don't want to say, go ahead and do that, take on more during this period, but depending on people's unique situation, it has offered, you know, some boost for people that have always had something they've wanted to get off the ground to say, you know what better time than now?
That's great. Perfect.
And I will say too, I know we have to wrap, but I have my email here. I always, you know, I love, not that I'm asking for more work myself, but I love hearing from people because I learn, especially since this is a situation we haven't seen before. And so that's kind of my take on it. But if anyone had a question or a interesting thing they wanted to share that they didn't get to, you can feel free to shoot me an email.
Great. Thank you for that. You're getting some great feedback in the chat that we can all look back later. But in the interest of everyone's time and your time, Dr. Humbird, we thank you for sharing your insights and your knowledge with everyone. I'm sure everyone is going to have a takeaway from this session today. As we said earlier, it is being recorded, and we're going to send out a link to everyone so that you can look back at this if you like. And I guess that's it for now. I thank you again, Dr. Humbird, and I thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope everyone enjoys the remainder of the day. Take care and stay healthy.